Today is the annual lecture provided by the Zverina family. Back in 1978, the Anton and Rose Zverina lecture was established by the Zverina family. I'd like to acknowledge Fran Zverina's presence. We're eternally grateful. What it does for us is it gives us the ability to bring to campus some distinguished scholar. Originally, it was pretty narrowly focused on the history of medical technology. We broadened it at various times, but I think in some ways this evening's talk will come back to technology in a very real way. The speaker tonight is Beth Linker. She teaches at Penn. We had the privilege of being at a symposium with her last September in Kansas City on surgical innovation, and heard a really great paper on scoliosis and spinal fixation devices, and maybe we'll have her back to speak on that topic someday. But tonight's topic is the rehabilitation of soldiers in World War I. I won't go into any great detail, but give you a little bit of background on Beth. She got a BS at Ithaca College and then got a PhD at Yale, working under John Harley Warner, who's a co-author of mine, a really great historian of medicine. I think probably the most knowledgeable historian of American medicine in this country today. She's done some really great work that we, as our medical humanities reading group, has explored. She's done an essay that appeared recently in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine on disabilities and looking how that as a body of scholarship fits into or does not fit into the history of medicine. She also did a very entertaining essay on the place of biography in medical history. Biography was at one time the main vehicle of presenting medical history. Then it fell out of favor, and now it's kind of crept back in again. So she's dealt with some really interesting things that provided a point of discussion for us, and she'll be joining us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for our reading group. And if any of you would like to join us, by all means, please do so. It'll be upstairs in the Dittrick Museum. And we'll turn it over to Beth now. She's speaking on Disabled Doughboys, How the Great War Changed American Medicine. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the Zverina family for sponsoring this lecture and for bringing me out here to Cleveland. I am an Ohio native, and as I keep telling everybody, my family really thinks that I've made it now because I'm presenting at Case Western Reserve, and I made it into the Plain Dealer. So I have arrived. Okay. It's a pleasure for me to commemorate the commencement of the Great War here at the Dittrick Medical History Center. As perhaps most of you probably know, this is the season for World War I commemorations. History buffs need no reminder that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, set off an unforeseen set of consequences leading to one of the most catastrophic wars known to Europe. In the scheme of a war that would eventually consume 5 continents, the United States was a latecomer. Only after years of repeated German submarine attacks on American commercial ships, the most famous being the attack on the Lusitania on May 7th, 1915. Only after these attacks on commercial ships did President Woodrow Wilson declare war on Germany in April 1917. The sequence of events matters, of course, especially as we consider current commemoration celebrations. When should the U.S. commemorate the First World War? Are those of you here today too early? Does the First World War, and I think this is an even more important question, warrant a commemoration in the United States? Thank you. Thank you. I agree. I concur. The U.S. is way behind in its commemoration events. If you go to England, any place in Europe, the commemoration events are in full swing. This is the National World War I Memorial Foundation, is a foundation that is trying to raise money and to raise consciousness of the First World War. There is not yet a memorial that commemorates the First World War on the National Mall. Every other 20th century conflict and war is commemorated, but not the First World War. So maybe we're ahead of the curve here in Cleveland. I like to think that. And so, of course, as an author of a book on the First World War, I'm not going to claim that, that it's insignificant or we shouldn't commemorate it. I think it's very important to commemorate it. And I will go even further to say that what is happening here at the Dittrick Museum is how U.S. commemorations of the First World War should be taking place. Although our textbooks tell us that the start of the war was April 2nd, 1917, America was involved in the war effort, assisting Allied forces well before that date. And one of the best places to see examples of America's involvement in the First World War is to look at the history of medicine. One of the first medical teams to be involved in the war was the Lakeside Unit from Cleveland, Ohio. Thanks to the work of archivist Jennifer Neves and Diane O'Malia, there is a wonderful exhibit here in the Dittrick Medical History Center that tells the story of the Lakeside Unit. Let me give you a brief summary of the history and hopefully whet your appetite to go upstairs after the talk to go look at the exhibit. So soon after the war broke out in Europe, Myron Herrick, U.S. ambassador to France and former Ohio governor, asked George Crile, who was head of surgery at Lakeside Hospital, and he was also a former member of the Medical Reserve Corps from the Spanish-American War. So Herrick asks Crile to organize a surgical team to study the effects of combat on the war wounded. In 1915, Crile took a small team of surgeons, nurses, and technicians to Paris to work at the first American military hospital. The hospital would later become Base Hospital No. 4 in Rouen, France. The 1915 deployment of the Lakeside Unit served many purposes. Now, aside from offering humanitarian aid, the Lakeside Unit was supposed to collect data on war casualties and to gain experience from treating the war wounded in France. Lakeside was thus part of a large and pretty extensive war preparedness effort in the United States. This war preparedness effort was pretty far-reaching. The U.S. Medical Department actually sent convoys of doctors and nurses into what would become enemy territory in order to gain information and assist in planning for the care of sick and wounded if the situation arose. One outcome of these early envoys was the publication of an Army Medical War Manual, No. 5, titled Lessons from the Enemy, How Germany Cares for Her War Disabled. Now, although the publication date is 1918, this war manual was prepared before that. In addition to assisting the war preparedness effort, Crile had his own personal professional goals, which you will see on exhibit upstairs. Crile had an abiding interest in the phenomenon of hemorrhage and shock, commonly seen at this time in surgical practice. According to historian Peter English, Crile developed his interest after having witnessed the death of a fellow medical intern who suffered from post-surgical shock. War, like wars prior to this one, provides doctors with human material that they can investigate and that they can conduct experiments on. And Crile was no different in this. He hoped to advance his theories on shock and anesthesia. So after Crile returned to Cleveland in the summer of 1915, Surgeon General W.C. Gorgas asked him to outline a plan for organizing and equipping a base hospital unit for service should the United States enter the war. Crile's plan became the model for the Lakeside Unit, as well as those units sponsored by Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, and other universities. The Harvard unit is especially important for my talk today because the team included an orthopedic surgeon. Neurosurgeon Harvey Cushing led the unit with Robert Osgood as the representative for orthopedic surgery. Osgood and his Boston colleague Joel E. Goldthwait were itching to become involved in the war effort. Enthused by the gains that orthopedic surgery was making as a result of the Great War, Goldthwait already in 1915 said in print that he thought that the United States would ultimately assume some part in the struggle, even though the Wilson administration maintained an unmistakable position on neutrality in the early years of the war. Convinced that U.S. involvement was imminent, Goldthwait created in 1916 an Orthopedic War Preparedness Committee, a group that would inform both the American Orthopedic Association and the American Medical Association of the growing need for military orthopedics. As Osgood and Goldthwait's activities make clear, American orthopedic surgeons became engaged with the Great War during the early years of the conflict, assisting their foreign colleagues both intellectually and physically. American orthopedic surgeons felt not only allegiance to their own country, but also to their profession, which since its founding was quite international in scope. The American Orthopedic Association was established in 1887, and although it was intended to be a national organization, it drew members from many regions of the world. The membership roster included famed orthopedists from other countries, such as William John Little, Hugh Owen Thompson, and Sir Robert Jones. Those three men were from Great Britain. Adolf Lorenz from Austria, Julius Dollinger from Budapest, Fitz Lang from Germany, and later on Vittorio Putti from Italy. Orthopedic surgeons were also needed abroad, for the field was gaining legitimacy in most warring nations. When the war broke out on the European continent in 1914, orthopedic surgery had not been a recognized military medical specialty in the US, nor was it recognized in most of the belligerent nations involved in the war. This fact would slowly change as Germany, Austria, France, and eventually Great Britain experienced such massive casualties that replenishing the front line with fresh, able-bodied men became nearly impossible. Introduced first in Germany and France in the wake of such disastrous battles as the Somme, where armies endured upwards of 60,000 casualties a day, orthopedic hospital schools and vocational curative workshops became part and parcel of each nation's military defense strategy. These new programs in orthopedics promised to make moderately wounded men well enough to re-enter combat. And they also promised that if the soldier was so wounded that he could not be returned to the front line, he would be re-educated somehow so that he could be put into munitions and factories. So this would all still help with the war effort. And so once Germany, Austria, and France begin these rehabilitation programs, other belligerent nations quickly join in. And ultimately, this demand for healthy, functioning male bodies made rehabilitation, which is the subject of my book, seem like a necessity to the success of any modern state at war. As soon as the US declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, Sir Robert Jones, who is a famous British orthopedic surgeon, he wires Goldthwait and all the members of the American Orthopedic Association, urging them to come to Great Britain to assist him in the rehabilitation effort. Gorgas, Surgeon General Gorgas, endorsed Jones's request, telling Goldthwait that Gorgas wanted Goldthwait to learn how the British delivered orthopedic care so that the US could follow suit. The Goldthwait unit, composed of Goldthwait and 20 other orthopedic surgeons, they arrived in Liverpool on May 28, 1917. Less than a month after this arrival, Goldthwait already had impressive statistics to share with military officials back home. He writes, of the first 1,350 cases seen at a hospital in London, 1,000 men were discharged back into the army, and the remaining 350 were all discharged into industrial training. So these transatlantic relationships that are developing among orthopedic surgeons will become essential for the US, especially for these US orthopedic surgeons who are trying to establish legitimacy of their own field. Less than 4 months after the US declared war on Germany, Surgeon General Gorgas established a division of orthopedic surgery. Now, this was separate from both the division of general surgery and the division of medicine. Prior to the Great War, orthopedic surgery, as I had said, had not been a recognized military medical specialty. During the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, general surgeons took care of all types of battle wounds and were responsible for everything from amputating limbs and removing flesh-lodged bullets to bandaging fractured bones. But following the example set in motion by both the Allied and Central Powers, the US Army of the First World War gave orthopedic surgeons a level of administrative legitimacy and autonomy that they had never before experienced. Goldthwait returned to America in August 1917 after helping out Sir Robert Jones, and he quickly helped the creation of this division of orthopedic surgery. The creation, not surprisingly, drew support from the biggest names in the field, and the Orthopedic Advisory Committee to the Surgeon General consisted only of presidents and former presidents of the American Orthopedic Association. Now, from the outset, orthopedic surgeons intended to make themselves central to US military medical care, not specialists. That's how we tend to think of it. They did not see themselves as specialists who would remain on the periphery. Gorgas had given them quite a bit of leverage, and they maintained, and he mandated that the director of military orthopedics would be responsible for the care of all orthopedic conditions, and this meant also developing all necessary organizations, including special hospitals and the equipment, both at home and abroad. Other orthopedic surgeons, so we had orthopedic surgeons both abroad and at home. Some other orthopedic surgeons themselves took the definition of what their responsibility was even further, contending that orthopedic care of the soldier was to begin at the time of entry, and orthopedic care should continue continuously until the soldier was returned to active duty or, if disabled, to industrial life. Now, the Division of General Surgery, the older and better established military surgical division, was not too happy about this. They felt threatened by orthopedic surgery's newly found power. Dr. Charles W. Mayo, a general surgeon who had always taken an interest in orthopedic matters, yes, the founder of the Mayo Clinic, he protested the creation of the Division of Orthopedic Surgery, as did famed Philadelphia surgeon William W. Keene. In response to the complaints voiced by general surgeons, Goldthwait and his colleagues insisted that, in following the example of Sir Robert Jones and the British, it was obvious, to them at least, that the two branches of surgery had distinct goals and practices. So Goldthwait, Mayo sends Goldthwait a pretty angry, testy letter saying, basically, you're taking over our field, and really general surgeons are the chief surgeons who should take care of injured soldiers. And Goldthwait sends this rather clever response back to Mayo, saying, the chief difference between general surgery and orthopedic surgery is that with the latter, the operations that are frequently required are only incidental to the general treatment and can undoubtedly be performed by any reasonably clever surgeon. Following the operation, the great work of the orthopedic surgeon begins in attempting by means of special exercise, special apparatus, as well as a great deal of many other details, to restore the damaged part to as nearly perfect condition as it is possible to make. So basically, he's downplaying general surgery as, any clever surgeon can do an amputation, but orthopedic surgeons have to know everything from the surgery and also have to know everything about aftercare and how to get the soldier reemployed or back onto the front lines. So, in other words, Goldthwait wanted general surgeons to just stick with their simple operations, stick with the knife, and orthopedic surgeons would become managers of all other types of care. Now, as you can imagine, the task of caring for disabled soldiers from the front line to the assembly line required radical control. Goldthwait was fairly well versed in Frederick Winslow Taylor's The Principle of Scientific Management, and he employed those principles under his command. He became chief of military orthopedic surgery for the American Expeditionary Forces, and when he arrived back in October 17, he immediately set to work not only on the construction of 35,000 hospital beds, but also on the creation of a more efficient and standardized system of triaging orthopedic patients. In order to make sure that injured men did not go home with joint contractures, he established orthopedic stations at every step of the injured soldier's journey, from the interior battlefields along the Western Front to the northern shores of France, where ship liners would carry them back home, and also then at home he would have these orthopedic stations. Now, each of these stations would have a splint team consisting of one orthopedic surgeon and 2 orderlies who would then apply the appropriate leg splints or arm splints. These standardized splints were applied and reapplied at every hospital, from frontline field hospitals and rear-line base hospitals to transportation hospitals. Those were the hospitals found on trains, and evacuation hospitals. Now, this assembly line type of care, Goldthwait maintained, was necessary to successful aftercare at home. Output informed the preliminary steps of care. The point was to create a skilled laborer, and to reach that goal, it was necessary to ensure that limb functioning was conserved and deformity prevented. The home front orthopedic surgeons were the ones ultimately left with the task of building an infrastructure that would make the end goal of orthopedic surgery a reality. The largest task was the construction of military reconstruction hospitals and rehabilitation hospitals, and outfitting them with the proper equipment as well as qualified personnel, including medical assistants such as occupational and physical therapists, and I will have more on this later. These hospitals would house curative orthopedic gyms with hydrotherapy, electrotherapy, and exercise equipment, as well as workshops and simulated orthopedic occupational workplaces. Now, what I have thus far outlined, it turns out, is a fairly standard history of orthopedic surgery and really of World War I itself. I have provided you a story of significant change, at least if you look at it from the perspective of orthopedic surgery. My narrative of change happens to fit quite well with a lot of literature concerning the First World War. World War I is often thought of as a conflict that changed the fabric of life from the level of the very personal to the societal. There was a rift in time. World War I, more than any wars before it or after, had been, at least how US and Europeans had seen it at this point, was an event that brought about all-encompassing change in art, literature, society, culture, and last but not least, medical practice and science. You will find poets, so we have Rudyard Kipling and Wilfred Owen. Out of World War I comes Ernest Hemingway. We have the art movement of Dadaism. And in all of these works of art, there's a sense that the adolescent illusions that the world was reasonable or just suddenly disappeared. The poet Philip Larkin would write that there would never be such innocence again. And art and poetry at this time after the war would reflect a deep sense of absurdity, sarcasm, and black humor. Now, social historians of medicine have been some of the most vocal opponents to this argument that war brings about change. In 1993, historian Roger Cooter wrote an exhaustive essay on medicine and modern warfare. The purpose of the piece was to dismantle the tried and true argument that war was good for medicine. It should give us pause, I think, to consider the fact that we rarely, in my experience, never, hear the argument that a certain military conflict set medicine back. That somehow a military conflict made medicine go back to the Dark Ages. We never, ever hear that argument, and that should give us pause. The triumphalist argument about war and medicine takes on various forms and iteration. I'm sure many of you in the audience have encountered arguments about how the US Civil War was good because it brought about innovations and rapid response. You know, this was the rise of the ambulance system. And historians of medicine will look to it and say, well, that was when sanitary control was started, at least in the United States. Remember that, speaking of sanitation, remember that in most wars, the primary objective of military medical officers was to control disease because many more soldiers died of contagion and infections than they did of battle injuries. We could look to World War I and say that there were many great advances made in blood transfusions, plastic surgery, aviation medicine, research on shell shock, wound shock, and gas asphyxia. World War I is also said to have solidified widespread use of certain medical technologies, such as the X-ray machine, and it has also led, it is said, has led to the rise of the modern hospital. Before World War I, most medical historians have established that many people, middle-class people, people with means or money, would not go to the hospital. A hospital was a place to go and die, not to be cured. World War I helped bring us the modern hospital, where we all go to get cured or to get better. Moving forward in time, World War II is the war that really cinched the notion that medical good can come from the evils and horror of war. With the introduction and mass production of penicillin, the argument of war is good for medicine seemed to be sealed. One example, a clear example, is spinal cord injured patients. In World War I, 80% of the men who suffered a spinal cord injury would die, and that number would drastically be reduced by World War II to about 10%. Part of the reason was antibiotics, but part of it was different regimen of catheterization. And still today, if you look, I looked up online to see what are people saying about Afghanistan or the Iraq War. There are websites talking about medical advances. One of them I find curious is the tourniquet, is a medical advance for the latest war. That seems like a pretty old technology, but supposedly it's a one-handed tourniquet. So something about it makes it advanced and new. So this argument of medicine is good for war persists. Now, in order to resist the ease of this kind of argumentation, and indeed to show the perversity of an argument that insists that organized slaughter should be seen as the handmaiden to medical progress, Cooter, in his book on World War I orthopedics in Great Britain, makes an argument of historical continuity. His point was to show that few innovations, whether they be orthopedic or otherwise, were actually, quote, not born from war. So he situates orthopedic surgery in a long trajectory of splinting and rehabilitation. He argues that there were industrial accidents and that orthopedic surgeons actually learned their trade in industry and on children. He also makes the argument that the history of shell shock, so shell shock was a term that was invented in the First World War, and so a lot of scholars think that that's where medical treatment for shell shock started. But in actuality, if you look at shell shock, it has the same symptoms as earlier conditions such as neurasthenia, which was a very popular diagnosis in the 19th century, and another diagnosis called railway spine. So while I'm very sympathetic to Cooter's line of argument, I couldn't make the same claim in my book. I saw change everywhere. Now, of course, as I indicated in the beginning of this talk, much of the change came in fits and starts. None of it happened overnight, but change did happen, and it had a lasting effect on U.S. health policy, veteran welfare policy, and healthcare practices. So let me now turn my discussion to some of these changes in more detail. I've already shared with you the ways in which the profession of orthopedic surgery underwent a change. But what is more important to note is that the change was not internal to the profession itself, or even really to medical practice. If you span out to consider the political milieu at the time, and especially the politics of veteran welfare policy, it becomes clear that orthopedic surgery gained ascendancy not because it had anything better, medically speaking, to offer. Orthopedic surgery was important because it promised to solve a perceived social problem specific to the US context. So think of this. While significant changes were taking place in other parts of medicine, so bacteriology at this point had brought us germ theory of disease. In surgery, there are much better techniques in asepsis and antisepsis, and morbidity rates are going down. Orthopedic surgery, the practice and theories of orthopedic surgery remain pretty static. Aside from a handful of minor operative techniques developed over the course of the 19th century, the orthopedic surgeon of 1910 looks very much like his counterpart practicing in the 1860s. Men of both generations relied on trusses, braces, traction, and other mechanical devices to straighten crooked backs and limbs and to bring relief to painful joints. I should note here, orthopedic surgery was not really surgery as we think of it. They did not use the knife that often at this time or in the 19th century. So the novelty that orthopedic surgery offered came in the form of medical welfarism, a new kind of scientific charity in which medicine validated the felt social need to make the war disabled useful again. The rise of orthopedic surgery can only be understood then if one looks at the history and debates concerning the American veteran welfare system. On the eve of America's involvement in the First World War, the Civil War veterans' pension system was coming under great scrutiny. A growing number of early 20th century journalists, elected officials, and politicians argued that Civil War veterans who had once been honored for their sacrifice in the battle, these people were no better now than a deserter, a straggler, a coward. The Civil War veterans' fall from grace arose not from anti-war sentiments, but rather from perceived injustices in the Treasury Department, the branch of government responsible for paying out pensions to veterans after the war. The chart gives you a sense of the veteran pension system and how it becomes a bloated, targeted welfare system at this time. So by 1915, the aggregate cost of a 50-year-old pension system exceeded $3 billion, with the U.S. government paying out over $200 billion annually. Most Americans assumed that the cost of the Civil War pensions would take a drastic plunge by the early 20th century. Since 50 years after the war, very few veterans were still living and would be able to make benefit claims. But the opposite happened. With each passing year in the 20th century, more and more money went into the pension system, so that by 1915, the cost of the pension system had exceeded the actual cost of the Civil War itself. So in the years leading up to World War I, certain progressive reformers began to see the veteran as a problem to the social order. The primary criticism of the Civil War veteran welfare system was that it allowed pensioners to live off the government without the government expecting anything in return. Veterans became the symbol of war's waste, a term used at the time to protest the human and economic costs of war. In 1917, Woodrow Wilson appointed two internationally known and informed progressive reformers, Judge Julian Mack and Julian Lathrop, to draw up legislation to make sure that World War I veterans would not receive the same kind of benefits that was promised to the Civil War pension, to the Civil War veteran. Mack and Lathrop moved in the same professional and social circles, and both had expertise in family protection and the actuarial sciences. The two reformers drafted a complex piece of legislation that could guarantee government life insurance and a provision for the rehabilitation and re-education of all disabled soldiers. The War Risk Insurance Act, as it became known, passed Congress on October 6, 1917, without a dissenting vote. Now, the promise of rehabilitation was that it would get veterans back into the workforce and making them productive, tax-paying citizens. The notion of what the country owed its citizen soldiers injured from war became radically redefined in this legislation. The veterans of America's First World War were expected to become citizen workers once their military service was over. They were to make useful lives and not to languish at the expense of the U.S. Treasury. In a real sense, they were expected to be the opposite of the Civil War veteran. Now, we have rehabilitation on the books, but how is it going to be, once the rehabilitation legislation was on the books, how was it going to be enacted? How was it going to be operationalized? One way was physical therapists. This was an entirely new profession. There were no physical therapists before World War I, and these orthopedic surgeons knew that they could not take care of patients from the front line back home. And so they needed women, they wanted women, who were trained in physical education. So a lot of these women had backgrounds in physical education. They had a kind of no pain, no gain philosophy, these physical therapists. They would engage in stump pounding drills. So I've seen pictures of, amputee soldiers having to pound the stump because this was supposed to harden the stump so that a prosthetic limb could be put on. They were, in other talks I've called these women with brains and brawn. They were tough women. The other thing that had to happen is infrastructure in hospital and hospital beds. Prior to World War I, most hospitals were tents. And the belief, it was better to have a tent because you could tear, if there were any kind of infectious disease, you could tear it down and burn it. They really didn't want many permanent hospitals. But with rehabilitation, you need a lot of infrastructure. In May 1917, the medical department secured funding from the War Department for the construction of new hospitals. There were only 9,530 beds before World War I for an army that was predicted to swell 40-fold, numbering 4 million in total. So by war's end, the Army had spent approximately $2.5 building 149 hospitals with over 100,000 beds. So this gives you a little sense of why they needed all this space. Orthopedic surgery required a lot of space. One was this World War I Balkan frames, which the soldiers would, with fractures, they would put the soldiers in these Balkan frames. This was an orthopedic appliance shop. So this was a place where orthopedic surgeons would make limbs and adjust limbs. And here's an actually better picture, although this is not from inside a hospital. But the story is that, you know, most limbs were, prior to World War I, you would go to a commercial house to get a limb. And you would go to a limb maker, somebody who actually made limbs. You didn't necessarily need a doctor. You didn't need to go to a doctor. But with World War I, what we see is that these orthopedic surgeries start taking control over limb making, become interested in it, and they bring limb making into the hospital. And what's really interesting is that they bring limb making into the hospital, and then they have the amputee soldiers who are rehabilitating in the hospital come into the limb making and make their own limbs, prosthetic limbs. So it has a kind of totalizing logic to it. The other thing is that there were curative workshops. So the theory was that in World War I, for rehabilitation, you know, they had, have any of you been on a Cybex machine or any kind of exercise machines? There were those kind of exercise machines available also in World War I. They were not called Cybex. And you know, some people were saying, why don't we just exercise? You know, part of rehabilitation is exercising, building muscle strength. The orthopedist said, no, 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 we're not going to just have somebody on a machine doing exercise. We're going to have them actually mimic a workplace. And if you had to if you had to strengthen your elbow or your arm, you would do some kind of work that would strengthen your arm and elbow in a simulation. So here's an automotive repair shop at Walter Reed. So last but not least, the World War I shift from an entitlement model of veteran care to rehabilitative one led to the creation of the Veterans Bureau. This is probably one of the greatest legacies to come out of the First World War. The transition from the War Risk Bureau to the Veterans Bureau and then eventually the Veterans Administration was not a smooth one. Despite all the planning, the War Risk Bureau was caught unprepared with the signing of the armistice in November 1918, with no real infrastructure to care for the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who became veterans overnight. There was no non-military generalized hospital program for veterans. There was no plan for how to screen or rate disabilities, and there was no staff. In an ad hoc effort to cope with America's demobilization, the Bureau relied on the U.S. Public Health Service hospital until they could build their own hospitals. So by the middle of 1919 already, this should sound familiar to you, complaints about overcrowding was already starting to emerge concerning the Veterans Bureau. A congressional study showed that less than a year after war's end, there was a huge backlog of pending cases and not enough hospital beds to service the growing number of disabled veterans. One of Woodrow Wilson's last presidential acts was to appropriate $18.6 million to the building of hospitals for veterans and to create a separate agency that would become the Veterans Bureau. So in closing, I think it's fairly obvious that I think that a significant change came about in American medicine as a result of the First World War. That is, after all, why I chose the subtitle of my talk to be How the Great War Changed American Medicine. But I do not think that my argument of change necessarily puts me in the war is good for medicine camp. Above, I discussed how social historians of medicine think that the argument of change concerning war and medicine are overdone and indeed intellectually irresponsible. But change does not necessarily mean that there was progress. One could argue that the First World War changed American medicine in a value-neutral way. The change could be either good, bad, neither, perhaps a little of both. So, were the changes instituted with the First World War an improvement over what came before it? Isn't the Veterans Administration system progress? I get that question a lot these days. Well, I think it depends on whom you ask. If you ask an orthopedic surgeon, he would almost undoubtedly say yes. If you ask an economist who is interested in cost-saving measures, I'm not sure what answer you would get, because for all intents and purposes, the experiment of rehabilitation, and the rehabilitation was supposed to be a cost-saving measure. It was supposed to get rid of the expense of the Civil War, right? That experiment failed. Now, what if you ask the question of a veteran of war, or what if you ask an American citizen, or a person who has a family member in the military? In many ways, the rehabilitation and medical care model of veteran welfare was an improvement over the system of Civil War-era pension payments. Disabled soldiers from the First World War received health care and vocational training that they would have never gotten otherwise. Most veterans then and now want to move back into the workforce and not be forever reliant on federal funds. But war creates complex physical and mental disabilities, many of which go beyond the scope of medical cures. Moreover, the rather lofty vision of providing a veteran care until he's completely cured and return him to the workplace was a perennial sticking point. From the beginning of the rehabilitation movement, many disabled soldiers felt that they needed more time to recover, months and even years, before they were ready to seek out employment. From the 1920s onward, we see VA officers and doctors under constant threat of budgetary constraints, sound familiar? Have been motivated, they cut corners and they refusing to classify certain impairments as disabilities, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, and then shortening the durations of treatment. How the First World War affected medicine and healthcare in this country is complex and a multifaceted history. Today, I have only given you one account, leaving out many other histories that we could include, which would include the treatment and care of tuberculosis, shell shock, gas injuries, and the like. What I hope to achieve with this talk is to demonstrate the importance of the First World War to American history. The war is often peripheral to US history and also to the more European-centric accounts of the conflict. For me, however, the First World War is a crucial nodal point that bridges the 19th century in US history to the 20th century. And if we don't understand the First World War, we will fail to understand ourselves and who we are today. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
And I think that orthopedic surgery provided a good entree into the growth of
Yeah, they kind of grouped, the interesting thing about the rehabilitation movement, I mean, at this time, is they didn't break patients down by diagnostics that clearly. So you could have a person with shell shock, a person with tuberculosis, which was considered a disability at this time, a person with a fracture, an amputee, all rehabilitating in the same place. So, and the kind of, the psychological sciences at this point are not what they are today. And the primary drive, whether you had an orthopedic injury or if you were suffering shell shock, was the belief that if you could engage in work and get your mind off of the war and the trauma, you would rehabilitate, you would get better. So there was this very strong belief in work as work's curative value. You might want to talk to the archivists up here. I think they have a much better, so Jenny is up here. I don't know as much as I should about cryo, but if you go to the exhibit upstairs, and I'm sure Jennifer would be willing to field questions about that. Yes?
I think when I look back at the history of World War I, I think of the different models. The one model you proposed that bureaucracy didn't work in the end. And then you look at the Georgia trial model of multi-group practice came out of that model of needing to collaborate together. And that system today is the model of healthcare. So I think there's a whole other advancement that's occurring in medicine that either don't talk about or needs to be talked about.
Well, teams. I mean, there was a lot of collaborative work of medical providers. Is that what you're talking about?
There's the whole concept of multi-group practice, not necessarily bureaucratic orthopedic treatments, general surgery treatments, but I think that's what Cleveland has modeled itself. Multi-group collaborative practice.
I think it'd be nice to thank Beth again and then adjourn upstairs to reception.
Thank you.